Whistleblowers exposed a global conspiracy. Their daughter uncovered an even darker secret. Now they're all in danger. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video. Give it a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment, and share. The incessant buzzing of Lucas's phone pierced through the fog of his sleep-addled mind. He groaned, fumbling blindly on the nightstand, his fingers finally closing around the vibrating device. Squinting at the harsh blue light, he saw a string of missed calls and frantic text messages from Emily's mother. His heart rate spiked instantly, sleep forgotten as he sat bolt upright in bed. "Lucas, have you heard from Emily? She didn't come home last night. Please call me as soon as you get this." The timestamp on the message was 3 hours ago. Lucas's fingers flew across the screen, dialing Emily's number with practiced ease. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, each attempt ratcheting up his anxiety another notch. "Come on, Em," he muttered, throwing off the covers and stumbling to his feet. "Where are you?" Lucas and Emily had been together for 5 years, ever since their sophomore year at Northwestern University. They'd weathered the storms of post-graduation job hunting, family drama, and the general growing pains of young adulthood together. Emily was his rock, his confidant, his best friend. The thought of her being in trouble sent icy tendrils of fear snaking through his gut. He quickly dressed, his mind racing through possibilities. Had she gotten into an accident? Was she hurt somewhere, unable to call for help? Or had she simply crashed at a friend's place after a night out and forgotten to tell anyone? That didn't sound like Emily, but he clung to the hope that there was a simple explanation for all of this. As he grabbed his keys and headed for the door of his small apartment, his phone buzzed again. His heart leaped, hoping it was Emily, but it was another message from her mother. "Lucas, we've called the police. They're treating it as a missing person case. Can you come over?" The world tilted on its axis. Missing person. The words echoed in Lucas's head, each repetition hammering home the gravity of the situation. This was real. This was happening. The drive to Emily's parents' house in the suburbs of Chicago was a blur. Lucas's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind conjuring increasingly terrifying scenarios with each passing mile. By the time he pulled into the familiar driveway, he was a bundle of raw nerves. Emily's mother, Sandra, opened the door before he could even knock. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "Oh, Lucas," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Thank God you're here." Inside, the house was a hive of anxious activity. Emily's father, Robert, was on the phone, his voice a low, urgent rumble. 2 police officers sat at the dining room table, laptops open in front of them, while Sandra hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "Mr. Reeves." One of the officers stood as Lucas entered the room. "I'm Detective Sarah Chen. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Emily." The next hour was a whirlwind of questions. When had he last seen Emily? Had she mentioned any plans, any new friends or acquaintances, any changes in her behavior recently? Lucas answered as best he could, his mind struggling to recall every detail of their last conversation, their last text exchange. "She was fine," he insisted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We had dinner 2 nights ago. She was excited about a new project at work. Everything was normal." Detective Chen nodded, her expression neutral. "And you haven't heard from her since?" Lucas shook his head, then paused. "Wait, there was a text, yesterday afternoon, but it didn't make any sense." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his messages until he found it. The text from Emily read, "The crow flies at midnight. Remember the red door?" "What does that mean?" Detective Chen leaned forward, her interest piqued. I don't know," Lucas admitted. "I thought she'd sent it to the wrong person. When I asked her about it, she didn't respond. I figured she was busy at work." The detective's partner, a stocky man introduced as Officer Ramirez, exchanged a glance with her. "Mr. Reeves, may we see your phone?" Lucas handed it over without hesitation. As the officers huddled over the device, he turned to Sandra and Robert. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice cracking. I should have known something was wrong. I should have... Robert cut him off with a firm hand on his shoulder. This isn't your fault, son. We're going to find her. The conviction in Robert's voice was a lifeline, something for Lucas to cling to in the storm of uncertainty and fear. He nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. Detective Chen cleared her throat, drawing their attention. Mr. Reeves, there are several other unusual messages here from Emily, all sent within the last 24 hours. Lucas frowned. What? No, there aren't. I would have seen them. The detective turned the phone screen towards him. There, under Emily's name, were a series of text messages he'd never seen before. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. Trust no one, not even me. Find the man with the scarred hand. Beware the smiling woman. Lucas stared at the screen, his mind reeling. I don't understand. These weren't here before. I swear. When was the last time you checked your messages from Emily? Officer Ramirez asked. This morning, when I woke up to Sandra's calls, Lucas replied, his voice faint with disbelief. Detective Chen's expression hardened. Mr. Reeves, I need you to be honest with us. Are you involved in Emily's disappearance? The accusation hit Lucas like a physical blow. What? No, of course not. I love Emily. I would never. Then how do you explain these messages appearing on your phone? Chen pressed. Lucas shook his head, his world spinning out of control. I can't. I don't know how they got there, but I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by Sandra's quiet sobs. Robert stood, his face a mask of barely contained anger. That's enough, he said firmly. Lucas would never hurt Emily. We need to focus on finding her, not accusing innocent people. Detective Chen held Lucas's gaze for a long moment before nodding. We'll need to take your phone for further analysis, Mr. Reeves, and I strongly advise you not to leave town. As the officers prepared to leave, Lucas sank into a chair, his head in his hands. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Yesterday, his biggest worry had been what to get Emily for her upcoming birthday. Now, she was missing, and he was a suspect. I'll find you, Em, he whispered, a promise to himself as much as to her, whatever it takes. The next few days passed in a haze of fear, confusion, and mounting frustration. Lucas split his time between work, where he could barely focus, and Emily's parents' house, where he joined them in fielding calls from friends and family, and anxiously awaiting updates from the police. But as the days stretched into a week with no sign of Emily, Lucas found himself growing increasingly restless. The police seemed to be making no progress, and their suspicion of him hadn't entirely abated. He couldn't shake the feeling that the key to finding Emily lay in those mysterious text messages. Late one night, unable to sleep, Lucas found himself poring over printouts of the messages. He'd written them out, arranged them in different orders, searching for patterns or hidden meanings, but they remained stubbornly opaque. The crow flies at midnight. Remember the red door. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. Trust no one, not even me. Find the man with the scarred hand. Beware the smiling woman. What did it all mean? Was it some kind of code? A cry for help? Or something else entirely? As he stared at the words, a memory surfaced. Years ago, on one of their first dates, Emily had taken him to a tiny, hole-in-the-wall bookstore in a less-than-savory part of Chicago. The store had specialized in mystery novels and true crime books. Emily, a voracious reader with a particular fondness for mysteries, had been in heaven. The store's name suddenly came back to him: the Red Door Books. Lucas sat up straight, his heart pounding. Could it be a coincidence? Or was Emily trying to tell him something? Without allowing himself to second-guess, Lucas grabbed his keys and headed out into the night. The streets of Chicago were quiet at this late hour, the usual bustle replaced by an eerie calm. As he drove, Lucas's mind raced. What would he find at the bookstore? Would it even still be there after all these years? After several wrong turns down dimly lit side streets, Lucas finally found it. The Red Door books stood tucked between a pawn shop and a boarded-up laundromat. The red door that gave the store its name was faded and peeling, but still unmistakable. Lucas parked across the street, his palms sweating as he stared at the storefront. The windows were dark, a closed sign visible even from this distance. Of course it was closed. It was the middle of the night. What had he expected? He was about to start the car and head home, berating himself for this wild goose chase, when movement caught his eye. A shadow passed behind the darkened windows of the bookstore. Someone was inside. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. Should he call the police? But what would he tell them? That he was following a hunch based on cryptic text messages that he couldn't explain? Before he could decide, the red door creaked open. A figure stepped out, glancing furtively up and down the street before hurrying away. In the dim glow of the streetlights, Lucas caught a glimpse of the person's face. It was a woman he'd never seen before, middle-aged with sharp features and graying hair. But what made his blood run cold was the expression on her face. She was smiling. Beware the smiling woman. Lucas's heart hammered in his chest. This couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow, some way, this woman was connected to Emily's disappearance. He had to follow her. Silently thanking his past self for choosing a nondescript sedan rather than something flashier, Lucas started his car and began to trail the woman at a discreet distance. She walked briskly, her head down, occasionally glancing over her shoulder. Lucas kept well back, his palms slick with sweat on the steering wheel. After about 15 minutes, the woman turned down an alley between two abandoned warehouses. Lucas parked his car and followed on foot, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn back. But the thought of Emily, alone and possibly in danger, spurred him on. The alley opened up into a small courtyard, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Lucas crept forward, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Suddenly, a hand clamped over his mouth from behind. Before he could react, he felt the cold press of metal against his neck. "Don't move," a voice hissed in his ear. "Don't make a sound." Lucas froze, his mind racing. This was it. He'd walked right into a trap. He'd never see Emily again. He'd never get the chance to tell her. "Lucas?" The voice changed, became achingly familiar. The hand over his mouth loosened. He spun around, hardly daring to believe it. There, her face pale and drawn but very much alive, stood Emily. "Em," he choked out. "What? How?" She pressed a finger to his lips, her eyes wide with fear. "We don't have much time. I'm so sorry, Lucas. I never meant for you to get involved in this." "Involved in what?" Lucas demanded, his relief at seeing her alive warring with his confusion and the lingering fear. "Emily, what's going on? Why did you disappear? Why the cryptic messages?" Emily glanced nervously over her shoulder. "It's complicated. I've stumbled onto something big, something dangerous. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong. I need your help." Lucas's head was spinning. This felt like a scene from one of Emily's beloved mystery novels, not real life. But the fear in Emily's eyes, the tremor in her voice, those were all too real. "Of course I'll help you," he said without hesitation. "But you need to tell me what's going on. Now." Emily took a deep breath, seeming to steel herself. "It started at work. I'm a data analyst, you know that. But a few months ago, I noticed some discrepancies in the financial reports I was working on. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. But the more I dug, the more I realized—" She trailed off, her eyes darting around the courtyard again. "We can't talk here. It's not safe. We need to go." "Go where?" Lucas asked, struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire revelations. "Somewhere they can't find us," Emily replied cryptically. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. "Everything I've discovered is in here. Names, dates, amounts. It's all connected. The company, the police, even some government officials. It's a conspiracy that goes deeper than I ever imagined." Lucas stared at her, feeling as though he'd stepped into an alternate reality. This didn't sound like the Emily he knew. Level-headed, practical Emily who laughed at conspiracy theories and rolled her eyes at overblown crime dramas. "Em," he said slowly, "are you sure about this? Maybe you've misunderstood something. We should go to the police, explain everything." "No!" Emily's vehemence startled him. "The police can't be trusted. Some of them are involved. That's why I had to disappear. They were getting close to figuring out what I knew. I couldn't risk them finding me, or hurting you to get to me." The pieces were starting to fall into place in Lucas's mind. The mysterious messages, the suspicious detective, the woman at the bookstore. But it still seemed too fantastic to be real. "What about your parents?" he asked. "They've been worried sick. We all have." Guilt flashed across Emily's face. "I know. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell them I was okay, but it was too risky. I thought if everyone believed I was missing, they'd stop looking for me." A noise from the alley made them both jump. Emily grabbed Lucas's arm. "We have to go, now. I'll explain everything, I promise, but we need to get somewhere safe first." Lucas hesitated for a split second. Everything in him screamed that this was insane, that he should call the police, that he should demand more answers. But looking into Emily's eyes, seeing the mix of fear and determination there, he knew he had no choice. He loved her, he trusted her, and if she said they were in danger, he believed her. "Okay," he said, squeezing her hand. "Lead the way." As they slipped out of the courtyard and into the labyrinth of Chicago's back streets, Lucas felt as though he was leaving his old life behind. Whatever lay ahead, whatever danger they were facing, he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Emily led them through a dizzying series of turns, occasionally doubling back or ducking into doorways when she thought she heard footsteps. Lucas followed, his mind reeling, trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. Finally, they arrived at a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Emily ushered him quickly into a room on the second floor, locking and bolting the door behind them. The room was small and sparse, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. A single bed took up most of the space, its faded comforter looking like it had seen better days. A rickety table by the window held a laptop and a stack of papers. Emily sank onto the edge of the bed, the adrenaline seeming to drain out of her. In the harsh fluorescent light, Lucas could see dark circles under her eyes and a gauntness to her cheeks that hadn't been there a week ago. "Em," he said gently, sitting beside her. "Please, tell me what's going on." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "It started about 3 months ago. I was working on a routine audit for one of our biggest clients, Meridian Pharmaceuticals. At first, everything seemed normal. But then I noticed some discrepancies in their R&D spending. Large sums of money being funneled into projects that didn't seem to exist." Lucas frowned. Couldn't it have been a mistake? Or maybe classified research? Emily shook her head, her eyes intense. "That's what I thought at first. But the more I dug, the more suspicious it became. These weren't just accounting errors, Lucas. The numbers were too precise, the patterns too consistent. Someone was deliberately hiding something." She stood up and began pacing the small room, her words coming faster now. "I started looking into other clients, other projects, and I found the same thing, over and over again. Money disappearing into shell companies, fake research projects, offshore accounts. It was like uncovering a massive web of financial deceit." Lucas listened, his mind struggling to keep up. But why? What were they hiding? Emily stopped pacing and turned to face him, her expression grave. "That's what I couldn't figure out at first. But then I started noticing connections. The same names kept popping up across different companies. And not just any names, Lucas. Politicians, judges, high-ranking police officials." She grabbed her laptop from the table and opened it, typing furiously. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen towards him. Lucas leaned in, his eyes widening as he took in the complex web of connections displayed on the screen. It was like looking at a spider's web, with lines connecting various names, companies, and amounts. "This is incredible, Em," he breathed. "But it's also terrifying. If what you're saying is true, this is huge. We're talking about corruption at the highest levels." Emily nodded grimly. "Exactly. And that's why I had to disappear. I was getting close to something big. I could feel it. But then I noticed I was being followed. My computer at work was hacked. I even found a bug in my apartment." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. "Why didn't you come to me? I could have helped you." "I wanted to protect you," Emily said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "I thought if I disappeared, they'd focus on finding me and leave you alone. I never imagined you'd get pulled into this." Lucas squeezed her hand, his heart aching at the thought of what she must have gone through alone. "We're in this together now," he said firmly. "No matter what happens." Emily's eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, she looked like she might break down. But then she took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "There's more," she said. "I think I've figured out what they're really hiding." She turned back to her laptop, pulling up a series of documents. "It's not just about money. The pharmaceutical companies, the politicians, the police, they're all connected to a series of clinical trials. Trials that were supposedly shut down years ago due to ethical concerns." Lucas leaned in, scanning the documents. His blood ran cold as he read. "Human experimentation," he whispered in disbelief. Emily nodded grimly. "Not just any experimentation. They're developing some kind of drug, something that can alter human behavior, maybe even control it. The potential applications are terrifying. Imagine if they could make people more susceptible to suggestion or erase memories or—" She trailed off, shuddering. Lucas wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "This is insane," he murmured. "It's like something out of a sci-fi movie." "I know how it sounds," Emily said, "but I've seen the evidence. It's real, Lucas, and they'll do anything to keep it secret." As if on cue, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Emily's face drained of color. "They've found us," she whispered. Lucas stood, positioning himself between Emily and the door. "What do we do?" he asked, his heart pounding. Emily was already moving, shoving papers and her laptop into a backpack. "There's a fire escape outside the window," she said urgently. "We need to go. Now." The knocking came again, louder this time. "Miss Parker," a muffled voice called. "This is Detective Chen. We know you're in there. Please open the door." Lucas's mind raced. Detective Chen, the same detective who had questioned him about Emily's disappearance. How had she found them? Emily was already at the window, struggling with the rusty latch. Lucas moved to help her, and together they managed to force it open. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of the city below. "Miss Parker, Mr. Reeves," Detective Chen's voice came again, more insistent now. "We just want to talk. Please open the door." Emily swung one leg over the windowsill, her eyes wild with fear. "Come on," she hissed to Lucas. He hesitated for a split second. Part of him wanted to open the door, to try and explain, to believe that the police could help them. But the fear in Emily's eyes, the evidence he'd seen, it was enough to propel him into action. As Lucas climbed out onto the fire escape, they heard the sound of a key in the lock. Detective Chen must have gotten a master key from the motel manager. "Go, go!" Emily urged, already clattering down the metal stairs. They had just reached the bottom when the window above them slammed open. "Stop!" Detective Chen's voice rang out. Lucas and Emily didn't look back. They ran, their feet pounding on the pavement, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They darted down alleys, across streets, weaving through the late-night traffic of Chicago. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Emily pulled Lucas into the shadow of a doorway. They stood there, chests heaving, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. "I think we lost them," Lucas whispered after a moment. Emily nodded, still too out of breath to speak. She leaned against him, and Lucas could feel her trembling. "What now?" he asked softly. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We need to get out of the city," she said. "I have a friend, someone I trust. He has a cabin up in Wisconsin. We can hide out there, figure out our next move." Lucas nodded, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. Just a week ago, his biggest concern had been what to get Emily for her birthday. Now they were fugitives, running from the police, caught up in a conspiracy that seemed too vast and terrifying to comprehend. As they cautiously made their way through the darkened streets, Lucas couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. But then he looked at Emily, determined, brilliant Emily, and knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The journey to Wisconsin was tense and exhausting. They avoided main roads and public transportation, paranoid that they were being tracked. Instead, they hitchhiked when they could, walked when they couldn't, sleeping in shifts in abandoned buildings or dense patches of woods. It took them 3 days to reach the cabin, a small rustic structure nestled deep in the northern Wisconsin forests. Emily's friend, a man named Mike, whom she knew from college, met them at the edge of the property. Mike was a tall, lanky man with a wild beard and suspicious eyes. He ushered them inside quickly, constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting pursuers to burst forth at any moment. "You two look like hell," he commented as he locked the cabin door behind them. Emily managed a weak smile. "Thanks for this, Mike. I know it's a risk." He waved her off. "Don't mention it. After what you told me, well, let's just say I'm happy to help stick it to the man." As Mike showed them around the small cabin and got them settled, Lucas found himself studying the man. There was something off about him, a nervous energy that set Lucas on edge. But Emily seemed to trust him, and right now, trust was in short supply. That night, as they sat around the cabin's small fireplace, Emily laid out everything she knew. She showed Mike and Lucas the documents she'd managed to save, explained the connections she'd uncovered, the experiments she suspected were being conducted. Mike listened with rapt attention, occasionally interjecting with questions or theories of his own. Lucas, for his part, felt increasingly out of his depth. The scope of what Emily was describing was staggering. "So what's the plan?" Mike asked finally, as Emily's explanation wound down. "You can't hide out here forever." Emily nodded, her face set in determined lines. "We need to expose them, all of it, the corruption, the experiments, everything." "How?" Lucas asked. "If what you're saying is true, they have people everywhere, the media, the government." "The internet," Mike interjected. "We leak everything online, every document, every connection. Let the people see the truth for themselves." Emily shook her head. "It's not that simple. We need hard evidence, something they can't deny or cover up. And for that," she took a deep breath, "we need to go back to Chicago." Lucas felt his heart sink. "Back? That's suicide. They'll be looking for us." "I know," she said softly. "But it's the only way. There's a server at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. If I can access it, download the files, it would be everything we need. Irrefutable proof." The cabin fell silent as they all contemplated the enormity of what she was suggesting. Finally, Mike spoke up. "I have some contacts," he said slowly. "People who, let's say they operate outside the law. They might be able to help. Provide a distraction, maybe, or some equipment." Emily nodded gratefully. "That would be amazing, Mike. Thank you." As Mike stepped outside to make some calls, Lucas turned to Emily. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. "It's not too late to walk away. We could disappear, start new lives somewhere." Emily's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Oh, Lucas," she said, reaching out to cup his cheek. "I love you for suggesting that, but I can't walk away. Not now. Too many lives are at stake. If they perfect this drug, if they can control people's minds, the world as we know it would end. Lucas leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. He knew she was right, knew that what they were fighting against was too important to ignore. But a part of him, a selfish part, wished they could just run away together, leave all of this behind. "Okay," he said finally, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. "Then we do this together, all the way." Emily's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. She leaned in, kissing him softly. "Together," she whispered against his lips. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Mike's contacts came through with an impressive array of equipment, communications devices, lock-picking tools, even a few items that Lucas was pretty sure were illegal. They pored over blueprints of the Meridian Pharmaceuticals building, planning every step of their infiltration. Emily's knowledge of the company's systems would be crucial, but they all knew that one wrong move could spell disaster. As the day of their planned break-in approached, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Lucas found himself jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the police would come crashing through the door. The night before they were set to leave, Lucas couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with all the ways their plan could go wrong. Finally, giving up on rest, he slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Emily. He padded quietly to the cabin's small kitchen, intending to make some tea. As he filled the kettle, he heard a muffled sound from outside. Frowning, he moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, but then a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow, moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Lucas's heart began to race. Had they been found? He was about to wake the others when he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure stepped into a patch of moonlight, and for a brief moment, Lucas saw his face clearly. It was Mike. But he wasn't alone. He was talking to someone, gesturing animatedly. As Lucas watched, frozen in shock, Mike handed something to the other person. A small, dark object that could have been a phone or a hard drive. Lucas's mind reeled. Mike was betraying them. He must have been working for Meridian, or the police, or whoever was behind all of this, all along. He stumbled back from the window, his thoughts in chaos. Should he wake Emily? Confront Mike? Try to run? Before he could decide, he heard the cabin door open. Footsteps approached the kitchen. "Lucas," Mike's voice called softly. "What are you doing up, man?" Lucas turned slowly, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Mike must be able to hear it. He forced a smile onto his face. "Couldn't sleep," he managed to say. "Just making some tea. Want some?" Mike studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nah, I'm good. You should try to get some rest, though. Big day tomorrow." As Mike turned to leave, Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. The game had changed. They weren't just up against a faceless corporation or corrupt officials anymore. The enemy was here, in the cabin with them, and they had no idea. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tension that filled the cabin. As they went through their final preparations, Lucas's mind raced, trying to figure out how to warn Emily without tipping off Mike. He watched Mike carefully, looking for any sign that might confirm what he'd seen last night. But Mike seemed perfectly normal, cracking jokes as he helped them load their gear into the battered old truck he'd procured for their journey back to Chicago. As Emily climbed into the passenger seat, Lucas saw his chance. He caught her arm, pulling her close under the pretense of a goodbye kiss. "Be careful," he whispered in her ear. "Don't trust Mike." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but to her credit, she didn't react otherwise. She simply nodded almost imperceptibly and squeezed his hand. The drive back to Chicago was tense and mostly silent. Lucas sat in the back, his eyes constantly darting between the road behind them and Mike's reflection in the rearview mirror. Every time Mike checked his phone, Lucas's heart rate spiked, wondering if he was communicating with whoever he'd met in the woods. They arrived in Chicago as night was falling. the city's lights creating a false dawn on the horizon. Mike parked the truck in an abandoned lot a few blocks from the Meridian Pharmaceuticals building. "Okay," he said, turning to face them. "You guys remember the plan?" Emily nodded, her face set in determined lines. "I go in first, using my old access codes. Once I'm in, I'll disable the security systems and let you two in through the loading dock." "And if anything goes wrong?" Mike prompted. "We abort immediately," Lucas said. "No heroics, no risks. We get out and regroup." Mike nodded approvingly. "All right then, let's do this." As Emily slipped out of the truck, Lucas felt a moment of panic. He wanted to stop her, to tell her everything he'd seen, to beg her not to go. But he knew he couldn't. They had come too far to turn back now. Instead, he caught her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Be careful," he said softly. Emily's smile was tense but genuine. "Always," she replied, before disappearing into the shadows. The next 30 minutes were some of the longest of Lucas's life. He and Mike waited in tense silence, both staring at the hulking silhouette of the Meridian building. Finally, Lucas's earpiece crackled to life. "I'm in!" Emily's voice came through, slightly distorted but unmistakable. "Security systems are down. Come to the loading dock." Lucas's heart leaped. She'd done it. Despite his fears, despite the odds against them, she'd gotten in. He and Mike moved quickly through the darkened streets, keeping to the shadows. As they approached the loading dock, Lucas saw a figure waving to them from a partially open door. Emily. Relief flooded through him as they slipped inside. Emily led them quickly through the maze of corridors, her familiarity with the building evident in every confident turn. "The server room is 2 floors up," she whispered as they waited for an elevator. "Once we're in, I'll need about 10 minutes to download everything." The elevator dinged softly as it arrived, the doors sliding open with a quiet hiss. They stepped inside, and Emily pressed the button for the 5th floor. As the elevator began to rise, Lucas felt a shift in the air. Something was wrong. He turned, just in time to see Mike reaching into his jacket. Time seemed to slow down. Lucas saw the glint of metal as Mike pulled out a gun. He saw Emily's eyes widen in shock and betrayal. He heard himself shouting a warning, his body already moving to put himself between Emily and the weapon. The elevator dinged again as it reached the 5th floor. In that split second of distraction, Lucas lunged forward, tackling Mike against the wall of the elevator. The gun went off with a deafening bang in the confined space, the bullet ricocheting off the metal ceiling. "Run!" Lucas shouted to Emily as he grappled with Mike, struggling to keep control of the gun. Emily hesitated for a moment, torn between helping Lucas and completing their mission. But another wild shot from the gun made the decision for her. She darted out of the elevator, disappearing down the corridor. Lucas and Mike tumbled out of the elevator, still locked in their desperate struggle. Mike was stronger, but Lucas fought with the desperate energy of a man protecting the woman he loved. "Why?" Lucas grunted as they rolled across the floor, each trying to gain the upper hand. "Why did you betray us?" Mike's face was contorted with effort and something else. Was it guilt? "You don't understand," he panted. "They have my family. I didn't have a choice." The admission stunned Lucas for a moment, and Mike used the opportunity to slam him against the wall, knocking the wind out of him. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the polished tiles. Both men scrambled for it, but Mike reached it first. He stood, pointing the weapon at Lucas, his hand shaking slightly. "I'm sorry," Mike said, and Lucas could see the genuine anguish in his eyes. "I really am. But I can't let you stop this. My family." Lucas held up his hands, his mind racing. "Mike, listen to me. Whatever they've told you, whatever they've promised, you can't trust them. Help us expose them, and we can protect your family." Mike's resolve seemed to waver for a moment, but then his expression hardened. "You can't protect anyone from them. You have no idea how deep this goes." Before Lucas could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed down the corridor. Emily appeared around the corner, her face flushed and triumphant. "I got it!" she called. "I got everything!" She skidded to a stop as she took in the scene before her, Mike pointing a gun at Lucas, Lucas with his hands raised in surrender. "Mike," she said, her voice small and confused. "What's going on?" Mike's gun hand wavered, shifting between Lucas and Emily. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice breaking. "They made me do it. They have my family." Emily's eyes widened in understanding. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "Is this what they want?" she asked softly. "The data?" Mike nodded, his eyes fixed on the tiny device that held so much power. "Okay," Emily said, her voice calm and steady. "Let's talk about this. We can figure something out, Mike. We can help you." She took a step forward, her hand outstretched with the flash drive. Mike's gun followed her movement, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't come any closer," he warned, his voice high and panicky. Lucas saw his chance. As Mike's attention was focused on Emily, he lunged forward, tackling Mike once again. The gun went off, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space of the corridor. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then Lucas felt a searing pain in his side. He looked down to see a spreading red stain on his shirt. "Lucas!" Emily's scream seemed to come from very far away. He stumbled, his legs suddenly weak. As he fell, he saw Emily rush towards him, her face a mask of horror. Behind her, Mike stood frozen, the gun falling from his nerveless fingers. "I'm sorry," Mike whispered again, before turning and fleeing down the corridor. Emily caught Lucas as he fell, lowering him gently to the floor. Her hands pressed against his wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Stay with me, Lucas," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, stay with me." Lucas tried to speak, but found he couldn't form the words. The world around him was growing dim, the pain in his side fading to a dull throb. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Emily's face, beautiful even in her despair, mouthing words he couldn't hear. Lucas drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of snippets of conversation, flashes of light, the sensation of movement. He heard sirens, felt the prick of needles, caught glimpses of worried faces hovering over him. When he finally clawed his way back to full awareness, he found himself in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the air. Emily was asleep in a chair beside him, her hand clasped tightly around his. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. The small movement was enough to wake Emily, though. Her eyes flew open, filling with tears as she saw him awake. "Lucas," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, thank God." She helped him sip some water, her hands gentle as she supported his head. As the cool liquid soothed his throat, Lucas's memories came flooding back. "The data," he croaked. "Did you—" Emily nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "I got it all. It's safe. We did it, Lucas." Relief washed over him, followed quickly by confusion. "But how? The police?" Emily's smile faded slightly. "It's complicated. A lot has happened while you were out. How much do you remember?" Lucas frowned, trying to piece together his fragmented memories. "Mike, he betrayed us. He shot me. After that, it's all a blur." Emily nodded, her expression grim. "Mike ran after he shot you. I was trying to keep you alive when security found us. I thought it was all over. But then—" She trailed off, shaking her head in disbelief. Detective Chen showed up. "Chen?" Lucas's frown deepened. "But I thought she was after us." "So did I," Emily said. "But it turns out she's been investigating Meridian Pharmaceuticals for months. She suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it. When she questioned you about my disappearance, she started to put the pieces together." Lucas struggled to process this new information. "So she's on our side?" Emily nodded. "She arrived just in time. Got you medical attention, secured the data. She's been working around the clock to build a case against Meridian and everyone involved. Lucas let out a long breath, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. And Mike? Emily's expression darkened. They found him trying to leave the country. He's in custody now. It turns out his family was never in danger. They'd been bribing him for months. Lucas closed his eyes, feeling a complex mix of anger, pity, and relief. When he opened them again, he saw Emily watching him with concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "Like I've been shot," Lucas replied with a weak attempt at humor. Then more seriously, "But alive, thanks to you." Emily's eyes welled with tears again. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "When you fell, there was so much blood." Lucas squeezed her hand, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "Hey," he said gently. "I'm okay. We're okay." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "We are, and it's over. Detective Chen says with the evidence we've provided, they'll be able to bring down not just Meridian, but dozens of corrupt officials. It's going to be the biggest scandal in decades." Lucas felt a surge of pride and accomplishment, tempered by a lingering fear. "What about us? Are we safe?" Emily's smile returned, bright and genuine this time. "We are. Chen's arranged protection for us. Once you're well enough to travel, we're being moved to a safe location. And..." She paused, her smile turning slightly mischievous. She may have mentioned something about a reward for whistleblowers. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "A reward?" Emily hummed. "Apparently exposing a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy comes with some perks. We'll never have to work again if we don't want to." The idea was staggering. Lucas had been so focused on surviving, on doing the right thing, that he hadn't even considered the aftermath. A future stretched out before him, full of possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. "So," he said slowly, "what do you want to do with our newfound freedom and fortune?" Emily pretended to consider for a moment. "Well," she said, her tone light, but her eyes serious. "I was thinking we could start by getting married. If you're interested, that is." Lucas felt his heart skip a beat. In all the chaos and danger of the past weeks, he'd almost forgotten the ring hidden in his sock drawer at home. The plans he'd been making before Emily's disappearance had turned their world upside down. "Emily Parker," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing in this world would make me happier." Emily's smile was radiant as she leaned in to kiss him, careful of his injury. As their lips met, Lucas felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had faced unimaginable dangers, uncovered earth-shattering secrets, and come out the other side stronger than ever. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The next few months passed in a whirlwind of activity. As Lucas recovered from his injury, the case against Meridian Pharmaceuticals and its co-conspirators built momentum. Detective Chen kept them updated on the progress, each new revelation more shocking than the last. The drug Meridian had been developing was even more insidious than they had initially believed. It wasn't just about mind control. It was about reshaping human consciousness itself. The potential applications ranged from treating severe mental illnesses to creating the perfect soldier, unencumbered by fear or moral hesitation. As the story broke in the media, the public reaction was one of shock and outrage. Protests erupted outside Meridian's offices and the homes of implicated officials. The stock market took a hit as investors scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Through it all, Lucas and Emily watched from the sidelines, safely ensconced in a secluded safe house provided by the FBI. They spent their days recovering, planning for their future, and helping Detective Chen fill in the gaps in the investigation. It was during one of these sessions, about 2 months after the incident at Meridian, that Chen dropped another bombshell on them. "We've uncovered evidence of international involvement," she told them, her face grim on the secure video call. "It seems Meridian was just the tip of the iceberg. There are similar projects in development in at least 3 other countries." Emily gasped, her hand tightening around Lucas's. "What does that mean for the case?" she asked. Chen sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It complicates things. We're having to coordinate with international law enforcement now. It's slowing down the process, but—" She paused, a small smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "It also means what you've uncovered is even more important than we initially thought. You may have just prevented a global catastrophe." The weight of her words settled over them like a physical presence. Lucas felt a mix of pride and terror at the thought of how close the world had come to an unthinkable fate. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Chen said, her expression determined. "We keep pushing. We follow every lead, uncover every secret, and we make sure nothing like this can ever happen again." As the call ended, Lucas turned to Emily. She looked pale, but her eyes were blazing with the same fire he'd fallen in love with years ago. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Emily nodded slowly. "It's just overwhelming to think of how big this all is, how much is at stake." Lucas pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of his still healing wound. "I know," he murmured into her hair, "but we did the right thing, and we're not alone in this fight anymore." Emily leaned back, meeting his gaze. "No," she agreed, a small smile playing at her lips. "We're not alone. We have each other." Lucas felt his heart swell with love and admiration for this incredible woman. Despite everything they'd been through, despite the dangers they still faced, she remained strong, determined to see this through to the end. "Always," he promised, sealing the word with a kiss. As they broke apart, Emily's expression turned thoughtful. "You know," she said slowly, "with everything that's happening, I think our wedding might have to wait a bit longer than we planned." Lucas nodded, understanding. With the case still ongoing and their safety still a concern, a traditional wedding was out of the question for now. "That's okay," he said. "We have all the time in the world, and when we do get married, it'll be perfect because it'll be us." Emily's smile brightened. "Well," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "who says we have to wait for a big ceremony? We could always elope. I bet Chen could arrange something small and secure." The idea took root in Lucas's mind, growing more appealing by the second. After everything they'd been through, the thought of waiting any longer to make Emily his wife seemed unbearable. "Let's do it," he said, grinning. "Let's get married. Just us. Right here, right now." Emily's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with joy. "Really? You mean it?" "Absolutely," Lucas affirmed. "Life's too short to wait for the perfect moment. Let's make this moment perfect." With trembling hands and hearts full of love, they reached out to Chen, who was more than happy to help. Within hours, she had arranged for a justice of the peace to perform a small, private ceremony via secure video call. As they exchanged vows in the living room of their safe house, dressed in the nicest clothes they had on hand, Lucas felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This wasn't the wedding they had imagined, but in many ways, it was better. It was a testament to their love, their resilience, their ability to find joy and beauty even in the midst of chaos. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice of the peace declared, her smile visible even through the slightly grainy video. "You may kiss the bride." As Lucas pulled Emily into a kiss, he felt as though his heart might burst with happiness. They had faced unimaginable challenges together, uncovered world-shaking secrets, and come out stronger for it all. Whatever the future held, more revelations, more dangers, more triumphs, they would face it as partners in every sense of the word. The months that followed were a whirlwind of depositions, court appearances, and media scrutiny. As the case against Meridian Pharmaceuticals and its co-conspirators built, Lucas and Emily found themselves at the center of a storm that showed no signs of abating. They testified before grand juries, recounting their experiences and presenting the evidence they had risked everything to obtain. They watched from secure locations as arrests were made, as powerful figures were led away in handcuffs, their crimes exposed to the world. The international scope of the conspiracy continued to unfold, revealing a web of corruption that spanned continents. Governments toppled, corporations crumbled, and the world seemed to teeter on the brink of chaos. Through it all, Lucas and Emily clung to each other, finding strength in their love and their shared commitment to seeing justice done. Their impromptu wedding became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, love could flourish. As the trials began, Lucas and Emily were finally able to emerge from hiding. They appeared on news programs, gave interviews to investigative journalists, and became the faces of a movement demanding transparency and accountability from those in power. It wasn't easy. There were death threats, attempts at character assassination, and moments of doubt when the weight of what they had uncovered threatened to crush them. But they persevered, bolstered by the support of millions around the world who saw them as heroes. One evening, about a year after their fateful break-in at Meridian, Lucas and Emily stood on the balcony of their new apartment, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city looked different to them now, knowing what they knew about the secrets that had been hidden behind its gleaming facades. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked softly, his arm around Emily's waist. "Getting involved in all of this?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. Then she turned to him, her eyes clear and determined. "Never," she said firmly. "It's been hard and scary, and sometimes I wish we could just run away and leave it all behind. But then I think about what could have happened if we hadn't exposed the truth, the lives that could have been destroyed, the world we could have been living in." She shook her head. "No, I don't regret it. Not for a second." Lucas nodded, feeling a surge of pride and love for his wife. "Me neither," he said. "Though I have to admit, I'm looking forward to the day when this is all over, when we can just be us again." Emily leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We'll get there," she said softly. "And when we do, we'll have the rest of our lives to just be us." As they stood there, watching the sun set over the city they had helped to save, Lucas felt a sense of peace wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The trials dragged on for years, each new revelation sending shockwaves through the global community. Lucas and Emily watched from the sidelines as the full extent of the conspiracy was laid bare for the world to see. It wasn't just about mind control drugs. The tendrils of corruption reached into every aspect of society: politics, finance, media, even education. The goal had been nothing less than total control, a world where the masses could be manipulated at will by a select few. As the verdicts began to come in, Lucas and Emily felt a mix of vindication and exhaustion. The main players, the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, several high-ranking government officials, even a few world leaders, were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But for every conviction, there seemed to be a dozen more leads to follow, more stones to overturn. 5 years after their fateful discovery, Lucas and Emily found themselves back in court, this time for the sentencing of Mike, the friend who had betrayed them. As they sat in the courtroom, listening to the judge deliver Mike's sentence, 20 years with possibility of parole, Lucas felt Emily's hand tighten around his. He looked over to see tears in her eyes. "You okay?" he whispered. Emily nodded, wiping at her eyes. "It's just, I keep thinking about how it all started, how different our lives would be if I hadn't noticed those discrepancies in the financial reports, if I hadn't decided to dig deeper." Lucas squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing, Em. You always do." As they left the courthouse, they were met by a sea of reporters, all clamoring for a statement. Lucas felt Emily stiffen beside him, her media face sliding into place. "Mr. and Mrs. Reeves," one reporter called out, "how do you feel about the sentence?" Emily stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Justice has been served today, but our work is far from over. We will continue to fight for transparency and accountability to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen again." As the reporters continued to shout questions, Lucas gently guided Emily through the crowd to their waiting car. Once inside, Emily let out a long breath, her composure cracking slightly. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted quietly. Lucas pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Then we stop," he said simply. "We've done our part, Em, more than our part. Maybe it's time to let others carry the torch." Emily looked up at him, surprise and hope warring in her eyes. "You mean that? You'd be okay with stepping back?" Lucas nodded. "I think we've earned a break, don't you? Besides," he added with a small smile, "I seem to remember something about wanting to start a family." The smile that broke across Emily's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "You remember that?" "Of course I do," Lucas said softly. "It's all I've been thinking about lately. A little house somewhere quiet, a couple of kids running around. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it?" Emily's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of joy. "It sounds perfect," she whispered. The transition from whistleblowers to private citizens wasn't easy. The world had come to see Lucas and Emily Reeves as symbols of integrity and courage, and many were reluctant to let them step out of the spotlight. But they persevered, gradually reducing their public appearances and passing on their contacts and resources to a new generation of activists and investigators. They worked closely with Detective Chen, now Chief Chen, to ensure that the fight for transparency and accountability would continue long after they had left the public eye. A year after Mike's sentencing, Lucas and Emily found themselves standing in front of a small, cozy house in a quiet suburb of Seattle. The "For Sale" sign in the front yard swung gently in the breeze. "What do you think?" Lucas asked, watching Emily's face carefully. Emily took in the neatly trimmed lawn, the cheerful flower beds, the tire swing hanging from a sturdy oak tree. She could almost see their future children playing there, could almost hear their laughter. "It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They moved in a month later, spending their days painting walls, arranging furniture, and slowly letting themselves relax into a life that didn't revolve around conspiracy and danger. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when one or both of them would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by memories of what they'd been through. There were days when the weight of what they knew about the world's hidden machinations felt almost unbearable. But there were also lazy Sunday mornings spent reading in bed, weekends exploring their new city, evenings spent planning for their future. And through it all, there was the steady, unwavering love they shared. A bond forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by years of shared struggle and triumph. 6 months after moving into their new home, Emily sat Lucas down at the kitchen table, her eyes shining with excitement and nerves. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Lucas felt his heart rate pick up. "What is it? Is everything okay?" Emily nodded, a smile breaking across her face like a sunrise. "Everything's wonderful," she said. "Lucas, I'm pregnant." The world seemed to stop for a moment as Lucas processed her words. Then he was on his feet, sweeping Emily into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. As he set her down, Lucas cupped Emily's face in his hands, marveling at the joy and love he saw reflected there. "We're going to be parents," he said in wonder. Emily nodded, placing her hands over his. "We are," she confirmed. "Are you ready for this? It's going to be our biggest adventure yet." Lucas laughed, pulling her close. "With you by my side, I'm ready for anything." The months of Emily's pregnancy passed in a blur of doctor's appointments, birthing classes, and nursery preparations. Lucas threw himself into getting ready for their new arrival with the same determination he'd once applied to unraveling global conspiracies. Emily, for her part, bloomed in pregnancy. The morning sickness and fatigue of the first trimester gave way to a radiant glow that seemed to light her from within. Lucas found himself falling in love with her all over again, marveling at her strength and grace as she carried their child. They decided not to find out the baby's gender, wanting to keep that one last surprise. Their discussions about names were long and often playful, each suggestion carrying the weight of their shared history and hopes for the future. As Emily's due date approached, they found themselves spending more and more time in the nursery, imagining the life that would soon fill it. The room was painted a soft green, with a mural of a whimsical forest scene covering one wall, a project Lucas had thrown himself into with unexpected enthusiasm. One evening, about a week before the due date, Lucas found Emily sitting in the rocking chair by the window, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Everything okay?" Emily nodded, her eyes distant. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing abstract patterns on her stomach. "About everything we've been through," she said finally. "About the world we're bringing this baby into." Lucas felt a flicker of concern, having second thoughts. "No," Emily said quickly, reaching out to take his hand. "Never that. It's just, we know so much, Lucas, about how the world really works, about the darkness that's out there. How do we protect our child from that? How do we raise them to be strong and good in a world we know can be so corrupt?" Lucas considered her words carefully. It was something he'd thought about too, in the quiet hours of the night when sleep eluded him. "I think," he said slowly, "we do it by being honest, by teaching them to question, to think critically, to stand up for what's right. We show them that yes, there's darkness in the world, but there's also so much light. We teach them about courage and integrity and the power of love to overcome even the greatest obstacles." He placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the strong kicks of their active child. "We tell them our story," he continued. "Not all at once, and not all the details, but enough for them to know that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they believe in something strongly enough." Emily's eyes welled with tears, but she was smiling. "When did you get so wise?" she teased gently. Lucas grinned. "I married a brilliant woman. Some of it was bound to rub off eventually." Emily laughed, the sound bright and joyous in the quiet room. Then she gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. Lucas said, alarm coloring his voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Emily shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, I think my water just broke." The next 12 hours were a whirlwind of activity. They rushed to the hospital, Lucas trying to remember everything they'd learned in their birthing classes, while simultaneously trying not to panic. Emily, despite her obvious discomfort, remained remarkably calm, her focus narrowing to the monumental task ahead of her. Lucas stayed by her side throughout the labor, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring words of encouragement. He marveled at her strength, at the sheer force of will it took to bring their child into the world. And then, suddenly, it was over. A cry pierced the air, strong and indignant, and the doctor was placing a squirming, red-faced bundle on Emily's chest. "Congratulations," the doctor said, beaming. "It's a girl." Lucas felt his heart expand in his chest, making room for this fierce new love that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked at Emily, saw the same wonder and joy reflected in her tear-filled eyes. "She's perfect," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse from exertion. Lucas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand to touch his daughter's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin. As the nurses bustled around them, cleaning up and running tests, Lucas and Emily remained in their own little bubble, marveling at the miracle they had created. "What should we call her?" Lucas asked softly, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. Emily considered for a moment, then smiled. "How about Vera?" she suggested. "It means truth in Russian." Lucas felt his heart swell. It was perfect, a nod to their past, to the truth they had fought so hard to uncover, but also a name full of hope and possibility for the future. "Vera," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "I love it." He leaned down to kiss Emily's forehead, then pressed a feather-light kiss to Vera's downy head. "Welcome to the world, Vera Reeves," he whispered. "You are so loved." The years that followed were a blend of joy, exhaustion, and more love than Lucas had ever thought possible. Watching Vera grow from a helpless infant to a curious toddler to a precocious child was a daily adventure, one that never failed to amaze him. Emily threw herself into motherhood with the same passion and dedication she'd once applied to unraveling corporate conspiracies. She read every parenting book she could get her hands on, joined mommy groups, and created elaborate educational games for Vera. Lucas, for his part, found himself becoming the kind of father he'd always hoped to be. He built blanket forts in the living room, told bedtime stories full of brave princesses and kind dragons, and never tired of answering Vera's endless why questions. As Vera grew, so did their family. When she was 3, Emily gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Ethan and Lily. The house was suddenly full of noise and chaos, and more love than ever. Through it all, Lucas and Emily never forgot the experiences that had brought them to this point. They were careful about what they shared with their children, not wanting to burden them with the weight of the world too soon. But they also made sure to instill in them the values that had guided their own actions: courage, integrity, and a commitment to standing up for what's right. When Vera was 7, she came home from school one day with a troubled expression on her face. "Daddy," she said, climbing into Lucas's lap as he sat at his desk, "is it true that you and Mommy are heroes?" Lucas felt his heart skip a beat. He and Emily had known this day would come eventually, but they hadn't quite prepared for it. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" he said carefully. Vera shrugged. "Tommy at school said his dad told him you guys saved the world or something. Is that true?" Lucas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your mom and I, we did something important a long time ago. We found out about some bad people who were doing bad things, and we helped stop them." Vera's eyes widened. "Like superheroes?" Lucas chuckled. "Not quite like superheroes. We didn't have any special powers. We were just regular people who saw something wrong and decided to do something about it." Vera considered this for a moment. "That sounds even better than superheroes," she said finally, "because it means anyone can be a hero if they try hard enough." Lucas felt a surge of pride and love for his perceptive daughter. "That's exactly right, Vera," he said, hugging her close. "Anyone can be a hero. All it takes is the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." That night, after the children were in bed, Lucas recounted the conversation to Emily. She listened with a thoughtful expression, then said, "Maybe it's time we started telling them more about what happened. Not everything, of course, but enough for them to understand." Lucas nodded. "I think you're right. They're going to hear things from other people anyway. Better they hear it from us." And so, over the next few years, Lucas and Emily began to share their story with their children. They told them about the mysterious messages, the midnight break-in, the betrayal, and the triumph. They explained in terms the children could understand about the importance of questioning authority and standing up against injustice. The children listened with wide eyes and endless questions. Vera, in particular, seemed to take the lessons to heart. She started a recycling program at her school, stood up to bullies on the playground, and once organized a petition to save a local park from being turned into a parking lot. Watching his daughter become a force for good in her own right, Lucas felt a sense of pride and purpose that went beyond anything he'd experienced during his whistleblowing days. This, he realized, was the true legacy of what he and Emily had done. Not just exposing one conspiracy, but raising a new generation to be vigilant, compassionate, and brave. As the years passed, Lucas and Emily settled into a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They had careers they loved, Lucas as a writer, penning thrillers inspired by their experiences, and Emily as a consultant for organizations dedicated to corporate transparency. They were active in their community, volunteering at local shelters and mentoring at-risk youth. But they never fully left behind the world they had once inhabited. Every few years, a new scandal would break. Another corporation caught in wrongdoing, another government official exposed for corruption. And inevitably, reporters would come knocking, seeking comment from the famous whistleblowers who had started it all. Lucas and Emily were careful about which interviews they agreed to, always mindful of the impact their words might have. They used their platform to continue advocating for transparency and accountability, to remind people of the importance of staying vigilant. As their children grew older, they became more curious about their parents' past. Vera, now a teenager with a fierce sense of justice, often asked for more details about their experiences. Ethan, quieter but no less perceptive, would pore over old news articles and court transcripts. Lily, the artist of the family, created a series of paintings inspired by her parents' story, abstract works that captured the tension and triumph of those years. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Vera broached a subject that had clearly been on her mind for a while. "Mom, Dad," she said, her voice serious. "I've been thinking. I want to study investigative journalism in college. I want to carry on what you started." Lucas and Emily exchanged a look, a mix of pride and concern passing between them. They had always encouraged their children to follow their passions, but the idea of Vera stepping into a world they knew could be dangerous brought up a host of conflicting emotions. "That's a big decision, sweetheart," Emily said carefully. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Vera nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I am. I've thought about it a lot. What you and Dad did, it changed the world. I want to do that too. I want to make a difference." Lucas felt a swell of pride, tinged with a hint of fear. "It's not an easy path, Vera," he said gently. "The work can be dangerous, and it often comes at a personal cost." "I know," Vera replied, her voice steady, "but you always taught us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, that sometimes you have to take risks to make a difference." Emily reached out and took Vera's hand. "We did teach you that," she said softly. "And we meant it. If this is really what you want, we'll support you every step of the way." Vera's face lit up with a smile. "Really? You're okay with it?" Lucas nodded, pushing down his protective instincts. "We're more than okay with it. We're proud of you, Vera. Just promise us you'll be careful." "I will," Vera assured them. "I've learned from the best after all." As the conversation turned to college applications and journalism programs, Lucas caught Emily's eye across the table. The look they shared was one of understanding, of shared pride and shared concern. Their daughter was following in their footsteps, and while it filled them with joy, it also reminded them of the dangers they had faced. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Lucas and Emily sat on their back porch, looking up at the stars. "Are we doing the right thing?" Lucas asked softly. "Encouraging Vera to go into journalism?" Emily was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we are," she said finally. "We can't protect her from everything, Lucas. And we raised her to be strong, to think for herself, to stand up for what's right. If this is the path she chooses, the best thing we can do is support her and make sure she's as prepared as possible." Lucas nodded, wrapping an arm around Emily's shoulders. "You're right, as usual," he said with a small smile. I remember how scared I was back then, how close we came to losing everything." "I remember too," Emily said, leaning into him. "But I also remember how it felt to know we were making a difference, to know that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. If Vera can experience that, if she can help make the world a little bit better, isn't that worth the risk?" Lucas thought about it, about the fierce determination he'd seen in Vera's eyes, so reminiscent of Emily's expression all those years ago when she'd first told him about the discrepancies she'd discovered. "It is," he said finally, "and who knows, maybe she'll uncover the next big conspiracy." Emily laughed softly. "God help us if she does," she said, "but at least this time we'll be able to help her navigate it." As they sat there under the vast expanse of stars, Lucas felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had come so far from those terrifying days of secret messages and midnight break-ins. They had built a life, raised a family, created a legacy of truth and justice that would live on through their children. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges Vera might face in her chosen career, Lucas knew that they had given her the tools she needed to face them. They had taught her courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right. And in doing so, they had ensured that their own fight for truth and justice would continue long after they were gone. The years seemed to fly by. Vera threw herself into her journalism studies with a passion that both thrilled and terrified her parents. She interned at prestigious newspapers, worked on hard-hitting investigative pieces, and quickly made a name for herself as a rising star in the field. Ethan, always the more reserved of the three, found his calling in computer science. He developed a fascination with cybersecurity, driven by the stories his parents had told about the importance of protecting sensitive information. By the time he graduated college, he was already working on cutting-edge encryption technologies. Lily, the artist, used her talents to raise awareness about social issues. Her paintings and installations often dealt with themes of truth, justice, and the power of individual action. She collaborated with activist groups, using her art to amplify their messages and inspire change. Lucas and Emily watched their children's journeys with a mixture of pride and amazement. They had raised three individuals who, each in their own way, were working to make the world a better place. As Lucas approached his 60th birthday, he found himself reflecting more and more on the path his life had taken. He thought about the young man he had been, so in love with Emily, so naive about the ways of the world. He thought about the terror and exhilaration of those days when they were running for their lives, trying to expose a conspiracy that seemed too big to comprehend. One evening, as he sat in his study working on his latest novel, Emily came in with a strange expression on her face. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you need to see this." She handed him her tablet, open to a news article. The headline made his heart skip a beat. New evidence emerges in Meridian Pharmaceuticals case, whistleblowers vindicated once again. As Lucas read through the article, he felt a familiar mix of emotions washing over him: shock, vindication, a touch of fear. According to the piece, new documents had come to light, revealing an even deeper level of corruption than they had originally uncovered. The conspiracy had roots that went back decades further than they had realized, involving figures they had never even suspected. "How is this possible?" Lucas murmured, looking up at Emily. "After all this time?" Emily shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't know. But look at the byline." Lucas scrolled back up to the top of the article and felt his breath catch in his throat. The piece was written by Vera Reeves. "Our daughter," he said softly. "She found this." Emily nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "She's finishing what we started, Lucas. She's carrying on our legacy." As the implications of this new revelation sank in, Lucas felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in Vera's accomplishment, concern for her safety, and a renewed sense of purpose. The fight they had begun all those years ago wasn't over. Perhaps it would never truly be over. Over the next few weeks, Lucas and Emily found themselves thrust back into the spotlight. There were interviews to give, statements to make, old contacts to reconnect with. They worked closely with Vera, sharing their insights and experiences, helping her navigate the treacherous waters of high-stakes investigative journalism. As they delved back into the world they had left behind, Lucas was struck by how much had changed and how much hadn't. The technology was more advanced, the players were different, but the fundamental struggle remained the same. There were still those who sought to exploit and control, and there were still brave individuals willing to stand up against them. One evening, as they were poring over documents in their living room, now turned into an impromptu war room, Vera looked up at her parents with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you find the strength to keep going, even when it seemed like the whole world was against you?" Lucas and Emily exchanged a look, years of shared experiences passing between them in an instant. "We had each other," Emily said simply. And we believed in what we were doing. We knew that no matter how hard it got, exposing the truth was worth it. Lucas nodded, reaching out to take Emily's hand. And we had hope, he added. Hope that by our actions, we could make the world a little bit better. That someday, someone would pick up where we left off and continue the fight. Vera's eyes filled with tears. Someone like me, she said softly. Someone exactly like you, Lucas confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. As they went back to their work, Lucas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The story wasn't over. Perhaps it would never be over. But as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, as long as there were those who believed in the power of truth, there was hope. And in that moment, surrounded by his family, all of them united in the pursuit of justice, Lucas knew that everything they had been through had been worth it. The dangers they had faced, the sacrifices they had made, it had all led to this. A legacy of courage and integrity passed down from parent to child, continuing to shape the world for the better. As the night wore on and the pile of documents slowly dwindled, Lucas looked around at his family. Emily, her face lined with years of laughter and worry, but still as beautiful as the day he'd met her. Vera, her eyes shining with the same determination he'd seen in Emily's all those years ago. Ethan, quietly working on securing their communications. Lily, sketching out ideas for an art piece that would help people understand the complex web of corruption they were unraveling. He felt a wave of love and pride so strong it almost overwhelmed him. This was his legacy. Not just the secrets they had uncovered or the corruption they had exposed, but the values they had instilled in their children. The courage to stand up for what's right, the integrity to always seek the truth, and the compassion to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Lucas stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "I think it's time for a break," he announced. "Who's up for some breakfast?" The family moved to the kitchen, the serious atmosphere of their impromptu war room giving way to the warm, familiar routine of a shared meal. As Lucas flipped pancakes and Emily brewed coffee, the kids set the table, their conversation a mix of case details and everyday family chatter. Sitting around the table, passing syrup and sharing theories, Lucas was struck by the strange duality of their lives. Here they were, a normal family enjoying breakfast together, while simultaneously working to unravel a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of society. It was surreal, and yet it felt right. This was who they were, who they had always been. As they ate, Vera's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She read it, her eyes widening, then looked up at her family. "That was my editor," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "The story's going to press tomorrow. It's really happening." A hush fell over the table as the weight of her words sank in. They all knew what this meant. Once the story was out, there would be no going back. Their lives would change once again, thrust back into the spotlight they had left behind years ago. Emily reached out, taking Vera's hand. "Are you ready for this, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Vera took a deep breath, then nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I am," she said firmly. "I've been preparing for this my whole life." Lucas felt a swell of pride, tinged with a familiar fear. He knew all too well the dangers that came with exposing the truth, but he also knew that Vera was right. She had been preparing for this her whole life. They all had. "Whatever happens," he said, looking around at his family, "we face it together, just like we always have." As they cleared the breakfast dishes and prepared to dive back into their work, Lucas caught Emily's eye across the kitchen. In that moment, he saw reflected in her gaze all the years they had shared, all the challenges they had overcome. He saw the young woman who had first stumbled upon a financial discrepancy, the determined whistleblower who had risked everything for the truth, the loving mother who had raised 3 incredible children. And he knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them head on. Together, they had changed the world once, And now, with their children by their side, they were poised to do it again. As the day wore on and final preparations for the story's release were made, Lucas found moments to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. He thought about the night Emily had first told him about the discrepancies she'd found, about the fear and exhilaration of their midnight break-in at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, about the betrayal they'd faced and the triumphs they'd achieved. He thought about the quiet years that had followed, when they'd focused on raising their family and building a life away from the spotlight. Those years had been filled with soccer games and school plays, family vacations and quiet evenings at home. They had been, in many ways, the happiest years of his life. But now, as he watched Vera put the finishing touches on her exposé, as he saw Ethan working tirelessly to secure their communications and protect their sources, as he admired Lily's powerful artworks that would accompany the story, Lucas realized that those quiet years had been preparing them all for this moment. They had never truly left behind the world of whistleblowing and corporate espionage. They had simply been passing on their knowledge, their values, their determination to the next generation. And now, that next generation was ready to take up the mantle. As evening fell, the family gathered in the living room for one final review of the story before it went to press. Vera read it aloud, her voice strong and clear, laying out the evidence they had uncovered, the connections they had made, the truth they were about to share with the world. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Emily spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I am so proud of you," she said, looking at Vera, but including all of her children in her gaze. "All of you. You've taken what your father and I started, and you've carried it further than we ever could have imagined." Lucas nodded in agreement. "You're changing the world," he said softly, "just like we always hoped you would." Vera's eyes filled with tears. "We couldn't have done it without you," she said. "Everything we are, everything we've accomplished, it's because of what you taught us." As the family embraced, holding each other close, Lucas felt a sense of completion. The circle had closed. The legacy they had begun all those years ago was secure, carried forward by the next generation. Later that night, as the house finally quieted and the kids went to bed, Lucas and Emily stood on their back porch, looking up at the stars, just as they had done so many times before. "Can you believe it?" Emily said softly. "After all these years, we're right back where we started." Lucas shook his head, marveling at the twists and turns their life had taken. "Not quite where we started," he said. "We're stronger now, wiser, and we're not alone anymore." Emily leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "That first decision to dig deeper, to expose the truth, knowing where it would lead us?" Lucas thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "Never," he said firmly. "It hasn't always been easy, but I wouldn't change a thing. Look at what we've accomplished, Em. Look at the family we've built, the legacy we've created." Emily nodded, a smile playing at her lips. "We did good, didn't we?" "We did great," Lucas corrected her, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they stood there, under the vast expanse of stars, Lucas felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, whatever new battles they might face, he knew they were ready. They had each other, they had their family, and they had the unshakable conviction that comes from knowing you're on the right side of history. The story of Lucas and Emily Reeves, the whistleblowers who had exposed a global conspiracy and changed the world, was far from over. But as Lucas held his wife close and looked up at the night sky, he knew that the most important chapters had already been written. They were written in the courage of their children, in the love they shared as a family, and in the enduring power of truth to light the way forward. And so, as the world stood on the brink of another revelation, another step forward in the never-ending fight for justice and transparency, Lucas and Emily stood together, ready to face whatever came next. Their legacy was secure, their love was unshakable, and their determination to make the world a better place burned as brightly as ever. The adventure, it seemed, was only just beginning.